the housing shortage, that there's other tools that need to be considered and are being considered by the city through this process. So this is just one aspect, albeit an important one, because we know that zoning helped contribute significantly to the housing shortage that we experience today. We have a lot of guiding documents. So our 2002 master plan that has been amended several times over the last 20 years has really helped shape the current policy. All of the conversations we're having currently do align with the policy even from 2002. I will skip going through the land use distinctions because I think importantly, getting to the data, I mentioned that we need 14,000 units. That averages 2,800 units per year. But since 2015, when we go back and look, we're really only averaging 538 new units per year. So we're grossly deficient the number of units being produced within the city. And many of those housing types that are being produced right now are really in the what I would call like the large format multifamily development of 20 or more units. You can see those pink bars tend to dominate, meaning most new housing that's coming online today is in the form of 20-unit large-scale multifamily development. So we really want to take a look at why is this happening and how zoning could be potentially amended sooner than later to be able to support some smaller scale infill development. So this was the starting point. So this was what staff recommended based on best practices, based on what we know and experience within the planning department. We are suggesting that we start the conversation about looking at our accessory dwelling unit requirements, considering a more streamlined process, considering modification to some existing requirements that are seen perhaps as obstacles for number of new accessory dwelling units. I believe the number was 9, meaning we've only had 9 new accessory dwelling units within the last, I think it was a decade. So we're not seeing the ability for accessory dwelling units coming online. There's a lot of reasons for that. Zoning is one of the pieces. We also want to look at the number of unrelated occupants. Currently in our definition of family, we do not allow more than 4 unrelated occupants to occupy a dwelling. So there might be some opportunities for us to consider an increase to that, but it might not be appropriate, and that's part of the conversation we need to have today. There's these 3 other buckets, if you will, topics of conversation that we'll be having. We're looking at our group living uses and whether there's a more tiered or nuanced approach that we could consider to allow from some small scale group living to exist in our residential neighborhoods. Looking at ways to support small-scale residential infill. Perhaps we consider allowing duplexes by right on major streets, and major can be defined as either link residential or network residential, tying it to our vital streets plan or our transportation plan, but then also looking at our parking requirements. So for ease of conversation, today I've really focused, or I'm asking you to focus your discussion on both accessory dwelling units and unrelated occupants. The other 3 buckets will come at, I believe, our October 12th meeting, where we will have a conversation of those other 3 topics. However, what I'd like to do today is at least, well, you're aware that we want to have those conversations, but if there is data you need or feel would be helpful to inform a future decision, we would like to know what that is so that we can be prepared with that data. Because I think those next conversations are probably far more challenging in the future than what we're having today. Because if we're going to talk about reducing or eliminating parking requirements, I'm assuming you're going to want to have some data from Mobile GR about maybe utilization of either our parking lots and or our on-street parking. And we do have tools that we're working on. I think it's in this here. Scroll through. We do have a dashboard that's been created, and I'll share a link to this. I don't want to be flippant, but it's almost like a choose your own adventure. So if we were to look at our LDR and we solely wanted to focus on a policy of duplexes on corner lots, when they're alley adjacent and when maybe they're on a transit route, you can start moving those levers so that you can understand what would the potential impact be. And I say potential because people have property rights of their own. Just because we make it available to become a duplex by right in this example doesn't necessarily mean that every property is going to transition to a duplex. And so looking at what is the potential change if every property were to convert, which we know is not likely and unrealistic and statistically or historically has not happened. And I don't know if Ryan Kilpatrick, I'm not seeing him here yet. He is going to attend today as well and can talk about some of those market-driven forces that can help inform some policy decisions. He prepared a good memo for me that I will email out to you that can help just kind of further iterate what he's going to say today. So moving back on what we're going to talk about today, really focused on only focused on accessory dwelling units and unit occupancy. My goal, my request is that I get feedback from you, hopefully some consensus. If you have questions or need information on data points, let me know. And then from there, staff will then develop actual policy or red line ordinance amendments that you can consider at a future meeting. Probably going to be end of October, early November when we have another discussion. And hopefully that meeting, presume it would be the first meeting, your first meeting in November, would then be red line versions of all of the amendments, because I do think it's important that we consider these things together, they're not solely separate or isolated, with the idea that you'll have red line version, an agreement on policy to put forward, and then you'll hold a public hearing on it. From there, that public hearing would be the opportunity for discussion, as well as receiving public input. Once I have a more clear understanding of the dates, I will send letters to all of the neighborhood associations and business associations that we have access to and knowledge of. We'll send just for communication that these discussions will take place. They'll be invited to participate at the hearing, and certainly staff would be available to answer questions about what is being recommended. And then, of course, these are recorded, these meetings, and we can refer back to past discussions. So hopefully, by the end of the year, maybe early January, your policy recommendation as your responsibility would go back to City Commission for final consideration. So for public, the Planning Commission is a recommending body when it comes to policy, when it comes to zoning ordinance requirements, and then City Commission ultimately has the final authority to determine whether or not to accept that or to adopt the ordinance amendments based on your recommendation. So that's sort of how I have set things up to transition through this conversation and next steps. I understand that today will be a little bit, I think, less complicated, less nuanced than future conversations, but I wanted to make sure it was manageable. We kind of get in the groove of what you're expecting from us as staff and what you need to make good decisions moving forward. So with that, we can launch into the accessory dwelling units unless there's questions about what I've just said.
I do have a question, but I don't know about the accessory dwelling units requirements presently.
So that will be the next
Okay.
piece of this presentation.
Thank you.
Sorry, I turned that off. So if you have questions about accessory dwelling units, then let's launch into that now.
I have a general question.
Yes.
In the big picture, we have identified what we think are issues with Grand Rapids, but how does that relate, do you think? We know that housing is an issue in a lot of cities. Mm-hmm. So is there anything that's particularly unique to Grand Rapids' situation? Or are we just another example of what much of the country is experiencing?
Ryan's not here yet. Brooke, can I call on you? Would you? So Housing Next, if the Planning Commission's okay with this, Ryan is here, Brooke is here. Housing Next is our housing practice leader, so I look at them as an extension of staff. They were the consultant or the support that presented the housing needs assessment, because I think it's not only zoning, but there's also market-driven forces here that are unique to Grand Rapids, and Housing Next is definitely in a better position to speak to that, if you don't mind us phoning a friend, and look who just walked in the room.
Look at that timing. So since he just walked in, I'll start. So as shared, my name is Brooke Osterman. I'm the Executive Director for Housing Next. It's great to see all of you. So the question was, are we unique here in Grand Rapids? So we know that there's a critical housing shortage. Is that unique to Grand Rapids, or kind of what are the unique elements of that here in Grand Rapids? So I'm sure many of you are aware it is a national issue, right? So we've underproduced for decades. But what we're seeing here in the city of Grand Rapids is that we are largely built out. We're also seeing some trends in the housing needs assessment that was referenced earlier, that we continue to see population growth, which is not happening around the state. In fact, in many areas of the state, most other areas of the state, they are projecting a decline. So we have population growth. We also have household growth happening here. And so those trends, alongside the underproduction, alongside costs increasing, alongside the uniqueness of being largely built out in the city of Grand Rapids, that is some of the unique factors that we're facing here. I don't know if, Ryan, you want to add any more, or you can call him up for a future question if that answers your question, sir. Thank you.
Any other general questions for me? Okay. So the first bucket or topic was accessory dwelling units, and this should be somewhat familiar to some of you. Back in, I want to say it was 2015, when the Great Housing Strategies effort took place, we did amend or update our accessory dwelling unit requirements. And I think the most significant amendment at that time was about process. Previously, all accessory dwelling units were special land uses, meaning they needed review and approval by the Planning Commission. There was an application fee. They must put together plans. And what we did was modify that process to say it could be a qualified review. And it's a little funny side story. We've got permitted uses, Ps, and special land uses, Ss. And we said, well, what's between a P and an S? And we were like, well, a Q and an R, ha, ha, ha. And then we're like, qualified review. So that's how that came to fruition. So, but on a serious note, true story, but serious note, a qualified review was intended to be kind of honestly, a marriage between, if we received an application, the planning department sent out a notice or a letter a letter of receipt to all property owners, occupants within 300 feet. It's exactly the same as we do for your special land use public hearing notices, of course. And effectively it said, we've received an application. If you have any concerns or questions and you want a public hearing, let us know. And within, I believe it was 15 days, if we received a request for public hearing, we stopped, we re-noticed it and scheduled it before the Planning Commission. You can probably recall how many accessory dwelling units you've received, because if it was one, it was one. I mentioned in total, we believe we have about 9 accessory dwelling units in the last decade that have come to fruition. So that would be the process. If no request was received for a public hearing, then it proceeded at a staff level review. And so really what that does tell an applicant is, do your homework. Communicate with your neighbors, because across the board, when neighbors hear something from us first, it sets a tone and a very adversarial one, because there's automatically skepticism, what's happening, and people go on the defense, right? And so we always encourage good neighbor communication, to reach out. If you're proposing something, let your neighbors know and communicate what that is. And in most cases, that then I think quelled any fears and then requests for Planning Commission public hearings. So that was the most significant process change that we had. But what it didn't go so far to do was to allow for accessory dwelling units to be by right or administrative staff level review. So when we look at the requirements today, that would be the process. But in order to also for the application to be successful, there's a host of criteria that must be met, or requirements. Some of them are setbacks, lot size, unit size. And what we're finding and learning through best practices, and we've given you a lot of information and I guess research that's been done that's attached to your packet. So to continue to encourage you to continue working through that. But through the best practices and conversations that are happening, we're learning that there's a couple of things or requirements within our ordinance that are making it a pretty significant barrier for accessory dwelling units to become more prominent within our market. And that is the owner occupancy requirement. And also the fact that we only allow accessory dwelling units in association with a single-family dwelling unit. So those are the two big items. There might be others that certainly we can discuss, but we wanted to call your attention to those, and they're obviously highlighted. So right now, we only allow accessory dwelling units in association with single-family residential dwellings. That's pretty straightforward. The owner occupancy is stating that in order to be approved for an accessory dwelling unit, one of the units must be owner occupied. So it cannot be a renter-controlled property and then also have a renter within the accessory dwelling units. I also want to state, although it's not called out here, in the city of Grand Rapids, because I know it's going to be a concern, in the city of Grand Rapids, we do not allow whole house short-term rentals. And the current policy is that that's not a part of the conversation that we're interested in having, meaning an individual, whether an investor, a landlord, or an owner, cannot build an accessory dwelling unit or a unit and rent it out short-term, less than 30 days, on its entirety. You can only rent a bedroom within your home. So, in short, these policy changes will not propose a change to the short-term rental policy, meaning we will not allow for accessory dwelling units to be constructed and then rented for short-term rental, Airbnb, pick your platform, for those kinds of uses. Okay, so these are only intended, these are currently and not up for consideration, is that they can only be used for long-term residential use. Put my glasses on. In order to have an accessory dwelling unit, you have to meet the minimum lot area for the zone district, meaning if you are a single-family home and on a lot that doesn't meet current minimum requirements for lot area and width today, you do not qualify for a residential or for an accessory dwelling unit. Building heights, those are based on its proximity to setbacks. We've got between 20 and 25 feet. Honestly, that's a pretty typical two-story size structure. We have not had challenges with that. That does appear to be relatively consistent with what I think we should expect, because we know that building form, architectural character are also important. As an aside, we know that we have historic districts that also have additional regulations that would continue to control or trump zoning building element requirements. We have a minimum floor area, that the maximum permitted floor area for an accessory structure that contains an ADU may be increased by 100% solely for the construction of the second floor unit. That really facilitates those above garage conversions or additions. It can't be permitted in a front yard or is not allowed in a front yard. The ADU shall not exceed 40% of the gross floor area, but in any case shall be at least 400 square feet and not greater than 850 square feet. I think that those numbers, I haven't seen a lot of need for change. I think it's obviously something we can talk about, and if you have ideas on that, I'd welcome that. But the idea is that these are really subordinate in size. They are accessory to the primary dwelling. And so typically that would mean that they're also smaller. I think in many cases there's a desire for generational housing. So perhaps I want to build an accessory dwelling unit so that my mother may live in it. And therefore, there isn't a need perhaps for a larger dwelling that could accommodate more individuals residing in it and increasing the density of the property. We do talk about maximum bedroom size, that there can be no more than 2 bedrooms within the accessory dwelling unit. We note that it can't be leased for 30 days. That just sort of reiterates that it can't be used for short-term basis. And then currently, we do have a deed restriction that is required, and that's really to try to control any potential conveyance of the accessory dwelling unit separately, so that if an individual is purchasing the property, and hopefully they would pull the title work, they understand that can't be separately conveyed. Also, there's the deed restriction does help with an understanding of the utilities. I mentioned that, zoning is not necessarily the sole enemy of accessory dwelling units. I'm sure Ryan can add to this in a moment, but the cost of construction is high. There is a state requirement in the plumbing code that says a detached accessory dwelling unit must be served by a separate sanitary sewer line that must be constructed. So that's not something that is within the city's control, so it's not on the table for discussion to do differently. But the water services is something that the city does have control over. In the past, if it's a detached unit, we've looked at requiring a separate water line. Understanding the expense of that, we are currently working with our water department to say, well, perhaps you can run it through the main house and run an extension of water to the detached unit. And I think the water department was really probably comforted by the fact that we had a deed restriction to make sure we understand who's occupying and whose responsibility, because of course, if there's a water issue in the in the primary dwelling and the water gets shut off, that means the accessory dwelling unit no longer has water as well. And so because of the issues I think that the water department has with similarly situated circumstances unrelated to residential, I think that deed restriction allows for a little bit more control as to whose responsibility is what, who lives there, et cetera. But that's certainly something that could be looked at, especially if we are eliminating the requirement or considering an elimination of the requirement of owner occupancy. So that's a summary of the requirements that we have today, as well as the process by which one would have to go through. So I guess I'd maybe, if it's okay, turn to Ryan to see if you have anything to add relative to accessory dwelling units. I noted to the Planning Commission earlier about some of the memo that you've provided to me, and I will share afterwards. I think that might be relevant too, because some of the things that we've struggled with is, if we make it easier to build accessory dwelling units and we make it so that it can be a non-owner occupied, are we going to see this significant increase in density and purchase by investors? And will we have concerns about the lack of ownership within the city and have more rental? And Ryan was able to provide some really good insight because, again, I feel like I have a good handle on the zoning, but the market, I rely on their expertise. So Ryan, do you want to say anything?
Thanks, Kristen. Ryan Kilpatrick, Housing Next. Yes. So one of the things that we often talk about as it relates to both zoning and economic development policy is we prefer to talk about those as dials instead of on-off switches, right? And so what has been proposed or brought forward as examples by staff is really a turning of the dial one notch, right? And so what that means is it will not likely result in wholesale change across the city or across a neighborhood. It's an incremental adjustment that makes it a little bit easier to build some housing product. But given the way that the market works, given the cost of construction, the cost of financing, our cultural proclivities, many of us who are homeowners might say an accessory dwelling unit sounds great, but not right now. Maybe when the kids are out of the house, we'll think about it. Or maybe when my mom is old enough that we want her to come live with us, but not with us. We want her in a separate structure. Those might be the points at which homeowners would say, yeah, we're thinking about an accessory dwelling unit now. So what we've seen, best practices across the country, is if you get 1% to 2% of property owners to adopt an accessory dwelling unit, that's a success. Right, that's going to be movement in the right direction, but 1% to 2% in a particular neighborhood clearly is not going to overwhelm the integrity or the character of the neighborhood. It's going to be one every couple of blocks, and that's likely the pattern that you'll see over the next several years. And so that's also important to keep in mind in the context of affordability, right? So what we're always striving towards is more affordability, but none of these solutions achieve like the ultimate, oh, this is going to be affordable for everybody tomorrow. Each of these are incremental adjustments that get us closer. And in order to achieve true affordability, we have to pair them with subsidies. So the zoning is the foundation upon which we can get more housing available to more households. But the way we make it affordable is we pair it with a subsidy. We pair it with an economic development incentive or a grant or something else. But what's important here is the grant alone doesn't matter if we don't have a unit to attach it to. So we have to be able to create more housing units and attach the subsidy to make it affordable. But then in the context of the broader market, what we're seeing is we just have a lot of people that want to live in particular neighborhoods. We don't have enough housing to support all the people that want to live there. And so adding 1 or 2 additional units per block via accessory dwelling units, or thinking about those link residential streets via another solution, right? All of those are small steps in the right direction. And that's it all combines to become a solution. Not one of those is the solution.
Ryan, you do the math probably better than I do. 1 to 2% times the number of households, what does that get us in terms of housing units?
So I would suggest probably over the next decade, if we got 200 to 500 accessory dwelling units across 80,000 households,
Okay.
we're making good progress.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Ryan. Don't go too far. I think, sorry, and I failed to mention one of the other requirements that we probably should be looking at is the parking. Currently, the zoning ordinance does require 1 parking space in addition to what's required for the primary dwelling. And I think that that is another fairly significant challenge in terms of supporting the inclusion of accessory dwelling units in our neighborhoods, because the creation of an additional parking space especially in the traditional neighborhoods, it doesn't fit. There's not enough land to add another parking space, which would be 3 parking spaces on a traditional single-family lot. And so what we see is perhaps if it's alley adjacent, we can come in off the alley and add a parking space there if that's desired. But then we start to see a decrease in the open space and the green space of the lots as well. So those are trade-offs for us. But what we're seeing is for best practices is to eliminate a parking requirement. And I had a good meeting today, and that doesn't necessarily mean someone can't build a parking space, but it means that as a city, we're letting the market and the property owner determine what is appropriate and what is necessary. So we want to control our setback requirements and how much of a lot is paved, but whether the parking is or isn't required is going to be whether it's market-driven, investor-driven, meaning from the finance standpoint, or just the owner, whether they think that they want that for their tenant.
With the parking requirement for the primary structure, say they're non-conforming, then would they have to add 2 parking spaces and an additional at this time, or not?
I would say no. If you've got a non-conforming circumstance, you can continue to support that non-conforming. So I don't see that we would require you to retroactively bring your entire parking situation up to code.
Okay.
So that was what I had. So I wanted some dialogue about, are you generally supportive of some of the changes? Again, that would be allowing them by right or staff level review, eliminating the owner occupancy, eliminating the parking requirement, allowing accessory dwelling units to be constructed in association with something other than a single family. Please insert what that something is. Maybe it's 6 or less units or just a duplex. And then also some feedback of, are you comfortable with the other requirements in place, such as the size of the unit, setbacks, et cetera?
I wanted to ask a question about the size. Do you know, I don't know, I guess where it comes from, the current, and I think I'm thinking more the minimum, right? As looking at some of the documentation around tiny homes, which are typically under that size. I mean, that's kind of that 400 square feet is kind of a 2-car garage size. My particular 2-car garage, and many in smaller neighborhoods are actually much smaller than that. It's, kind of 2 cars and maybe 1 bicycle, but I mean, they're very tight, right? So if you were to do it, so where does that come from, and what are the considerations on that?
Yeah, so my memory is that, a lot of it is not reinventing the wheel, of looking around and what ordinances seem to be working, and what are best practices at the time, what are standard 2-car garage, 20 by 20, and I'm not sure that there was a science to it, as much as looking at the architectural form and making sure that the architectural form or the building elements are compatible with what's happening either in the neighborhood or on the property. So I think in some cases when we created some requirements, and we've started to chip away at this, is that there was some concern that we would bring in a trailer, like a camping trailer, and utilize that. And I think that there was concern about whether that was appropriate in a neighborhood to install a trailer as a permanent resident. Now, I think that there's obviously mobile homes that can be built to meet building code, whereas, of course, trailers are not, RV trailers are not year-round here in Michigan. So I think that there was a little bit of concern there, but my experience is that if we're controlling for building form and making sure that the materials and some of the architectural character meet, do we need to worry as much about the size of it? We've got more modular homes that are being discussed and brought into our market. It is not, in my experience at least, easy to just simply pick a modular home and bring it and still meet our architectural requirements. There are changes that are expected and required, and I think continue to be a priority for the city. So I think we're controlling some of the concerns we may have thought we were controlling for with the size limitations.
Yeah, I would agree, and I feel like we're seeing a lot of studios now that are coming online that are, the market's changing, so we see studio apartments coming online in large quantities that are under 400 square feet. I mean, they're not a lot under, but they are under. And I think for me, along with the parking requirements, to me, it's a market-driven thing. And I guess I would be in favor of just removing a square foot requirement for an ADU as long as it does meet building code and other things like that.
Remove the minimum, I assume you're talking about.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Following up on that, does this allow one to convert a detached garage into an accessory dwelling? I mean, I know in Heritage Hill we have carriage houses that have been converted, but...
Yep, so again, historic districts are a little bit unique because there is the added layer of regulation, of course. So I think the short answer is yes, it could, and it could today allow for the conversion. However, if the garage currently serves as your parking supply that's required by the ordinance, then you need to be able to accommodate new parking supply spaces on your lot.
Got it.
I think zoning administration, we do a really good job of saying maybe, if, but unfortunately that's just how zoning works. So yes, it's possible, but there's other considerations that have to be looked at.
I'm supportive of what's been presented. I agree with Commissioner Yonker. I think either reducing or eliminating the minimum size requirement makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot else on the ADU front. I'm pretty comfortable with all of this. And even in our discussion with the City Commission, I felt like this was a relatively easy one to understand and to get behind. I'm okay with that.
Oh.
I would not want to open this up to short-term rental, so I'm glad that that's not on the table. I think that would contradict our goals for making these changes.
I agree with, what we already have in place and some of the changes that we're looking at. And, I like Ryan's illustration that this is a dial thing and that this might bring a couple hundred, but it at least gets us going in that direction and has been successful in other cities.
Yeah, and another dial that has to be considered, there's still building code. And so if the unit is constructed within the primary dwelling, meaning if it's an accessory dwelling unit that's physically attached or an attic conversion or a basement conversion, the building code, my understanding is that will look at it as a duplex, which means they have to be fire separated. So there's other, not inexpensive requirements that will be looked at because of those building code elements. I think that it sounds like we're making some headway on the financing piece, but traditionally, you couldn't obtain a construction loan unless you couldn't include, the rental income of the future accessory dwelling unit towards your construction loan. I think that we're making headway, Ryan's team, on that, which is also obviously an affordability issue because those that don't have access to the capital or the wealth already don't have the ability to create an accessory dwelling unit. So all of these, I had, I think, one of my slides looked at this specifically, that it's a formula here. Oh, there it is. We're solely looking at zoning requirements, but there's land values that are impacting these, the ability, the ability to afford construction, ability to get access to financing for the construction. All of those pieces also are working together and in some cases are working against us. So.
Yeah, it does feel like some of the largest impediments to creation of dwelling unit, these ADUs, are things outside of our control, right? Or even the city's control.
Yeah.
Whether it's a building code issue or the water sewer connection issue or whatever, right?
I think that's also, to that point, my concern with this. People of color, black people specifically, make up 20% of Grand Rapids. And when I look around the room, I'm the only black guy in here. So is this helping or hurting communities like ours? I don't know. And I don't think the answer is here, and I also don't think the problem is here. But I'm just saying that just to make a point that even I would like this. I think people, who own a home should be able to, do with their homes what they please. They should be able to create these to move families in. I love the whole age in place idea. I want people to be able to, stay in their homes. My grandmother works for her home, and she was able to stay in her home to the day she died. That was 46 years, raised my mother, raised me in that same home. So, of course, I want that. But I'm not sure if this even applies to the city broadly. I'm not sure if this is actually helping people who already can't afford to either live in the houses that they have, or people who may not make a whole lot of money to be able to move into the city. I'm not for sure who this helps or hurts.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. So I think anytime we can eliminate barriers, and I would argue that in some ways, coming before the Planning Commission is a barrier. And whether that's a good barrier or bad barrier, that's obviously a subjective determination. But when you come before the Planning Commission, you've got a $2,100 application fee. You've got architectural plans that need to be developed. You have a process. So if we are able to reduce the barriers, now that's applies across the board to everybody, but I think if you eliminate barriers, that is helpful. Also, what I didn't mention, and I should have, is that the planning department is currently working on pre-permitted plan sets. Right now, we are focused on, I believe it's duplexes and fourplexes, and so we would have plan sets that are available to the community at either a greatly reduced cost or a free cost that we are in the process of developing. And so one of the items that we wanted to add to that is the creation of pre-permitted plan sets for accessory dwelling units. So again, you're eliminating the cost of having to create a design because the plans will already be stamped by a design professional. And so we're starting to see what are ways that we can eliminate barriers that help our entire community, but also our Black and Brown community from being able to access these types of it's not a program, but these types of opportunities.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree, and I agree and I accept all of what you said. I don't think any of that is wrong. Anytime that we can remove a barrier is a good thing. I think my point is, I hate to use this phrase because I think people use it too often, but the fix is already in. That at this point in the game, removing the barrier is not helping the population, or at least it is my fear that it is not helping the population that we intend to help. So, yes, we want to remove the barriers, but what difference does it make at this point? Because we're not going to be going in the right direction. We're already going in the wrong direction. Removing this barrier just helps us speed that up.
Kristen, I have a question about setbacks. Many lots in the city already have non-conforming issues. You know, in particular, one thing I'm thinking of is, like, you know, in my neighborhood and many neighborhoods of small lots, we have detached garages, but they are right on the property line. And my understanding is if I wanted to put or if somebody wanted to put an accessory dwelling unit on top of or inside of a detached garage that is non-conforming in its location, I would still have to go back and apply for a variance? Or is there a way to remove that requirement if we're not getting closer and we have an existing non-conforming structure? Can we eliminate that hurdle as well? I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah. The portion of a single family. So yes, I thought we had that covered, but we can definitely look at setback allowances. I think one of some of the hesitation is that if it's an existing garage and it's non-conforming, meaning it's 2 feet or 0 feet from the side lot line, you're now adding a second story to that, presumably. And so I think the scale and the massing is significantly different, and also the use, meaning now there's people living there with windows that are going to be able to have a different view into your property or my property. And so historically, I think we've had some discomfort with that. So we've really focused on, if you're going to go above your garage, a detached garage or even attached, having it meet the minimum setback requirements was just one of those levels of comfort that we had. It doesn't mean that you could still add it to a basement or an attic if your home could support it.
Sure.
But if you think that we should relook at setback requirements, we can do that too.
Yeah, I understand the magnitude of that and what it might mean for a neighbor whose backyard is there. What I wonder is if we get, maybe there's some happy medium where if the neighbors do write letters of support, that we don't have to go through a whole variance process that, we can say, okay, the surrounding neighbors don't have an issue with this, something along those lines. Or are there, if, say it's a 1 foot setback, if I'm building a new building there that close to the property line, there's a building code requirement that maybe doesn't even allow me to put a window on that property line or on that wall because of the proximity to the property line. Is that something that could be looked at too, just so that, there aren't picture windows looking into the neighbor's backyard or something?
Yeah, certainly if there is this on the property line or the building code, or even not, the building code will dictate how much transparency can be along that wall. And you can make the argument at whether the building is 0 feet or 5 feet, does that does that really matter in terms of feeling like you're imposing or and have a view? I mean, 5 feet probably doesn't restrict a view into a neighbor. So I think it was more so about just the scale and the massing to support it.
I'm in support of these changes. I think partly want to acknowledge what I think Brooke said earlier, that the city is largely built out. And so if we were talking about greenfield development and with water lines maybe passing through two structures, that I think would be a whole different situation. We're built out with our infrastructure and our lots and platting and all that, which is why I think this is great. We're ready to get more nuance in how we do things. And we don't have to, some of the things that we had to guard against in the past aren't relevant anymore. And so we can be more surgical with these kinds of technical approaches.
Yeah, I think my colleagues, I think, are maybe correcting something I said. So if a detached garage is non-conforming, then going up in height would be increasing that non-conformity. And so it would have to be notched in, which, of course, that visually might not be appealing. I think also building on top of existing garages, it's not always the case that the existing foundation can even support the weight, or I'm sorry, I keep turning this way, cannot always support the weight of the addition. So in short, if it's non-conforming, the garage is non-conforming today, you couldn't simply go up because it would be increasing that non-conformity. Now, I think we could change that if we felt like that was appropriate, but the idea is that you'd have to meet your minimum setback requirements. So unless there's more conversation, I think I have some good marching orders. Again, you'll be seeing this in a red line version at, I believe, your October meeting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, at your November meeting. So there'll be another opportunity to say, no, Kristen, that's not what we meant, or we've learned more and we'd like to see some more changes before we schedule that public hearing.
So you have the clarity you need on even beyond some of the highlighted items?
Yep.
Okay, great.
I didn't hear any comments on setbacks, though. Were there other?
So that conversation's in item D, building height, and that does cover both the primary and accessory unit?
Detached, yep, attached and
Okay.
detached.
Got it.
Yeah, so I think what you're not seeing here is the nuance of the non-conforming section that says you cannot increase the degree of non-conformity. So if a structure has the footprint of being non-conforming, you can't simply go up.
And that's the case across the board, not just with
Correct.
creating an ADU.
Yeah,
So if you wanted to increase the size of your home, but it was,
yeah.
okay.
It's not in, it might have broader application or impacts than what I would think we'd be comfortable with, is to allow for expansion of non-conforming structures.
Okay.
Okay. So the next item is, I think, more simplistic in its explanation, but might garner more comments and feedback. We currently define a family, so if a single-family home may be occupied by a family, and where those occupants are not related, you cannot have more than 4 unrelated occupants reside in a structure, in a dwelling unit, pardon me. So one of the pieces of the conversation that we had at the July joint meeting is whether or not it would be appropriate for us to increase that count from 4 unrelated to, I'm trying to go back here, to something else. And I think that that's something else is part of the conversation that we need to have. I think for me, I'm not sure I'd recommend going above 5 or 6, because I think when you increase that number significantly higher than 4, it's atypical in family size. I think that there's other impacts that might be just unintended consequences, such as parking, for example, or vehicle trips per day. So I think that that's one of the numbers that we need to arrive at if we think that a change to that number is appropriate. We talked during our joint meeting that, a lot of landlords today, the practice is to rent by the room. And so if we add another room that's available to rent, the landlord can rent for more. And I think that that's true, but I think what we wanted to remain focused on is the fact that we have a significant number of people in our community that are looking for places to live. And if now you can share a dwelling unit from what goes from 4 to 5, we've opened up one additional bedroom, or of course it would be larger than that, but one additional bedroom to a person looking for a home. And it would be opened up at presumably a more affordable rate than if a person were to rent a unit by themselves. There's cost sharing benefits, certainly, if you're splitting either the rent and or the utilities across 5 people or 6 people versus 4. But there's also implications, like I mentioned, vehicle trips per day, for example. The demand presumably would be on on-street parking. I think many communities that have had this conversation or similar have also acknowledged that, maybe zoning isn't the best place to regulate these kinds of things solely, that we also have nuisance ordinances. It is not okay for you to park on your front lawn. There are residential parking permit programs that can be considered for neighborhoods that are overburdened, or they feel like they're overburdened with on-street parking. So there's other tools that the city currently has. We do have a very robust code enforcement team, very capable. And so I think when we talked about something similar in 2015, there was a lot of concern about, do we have the resources to handle the code compliance cases that we have today? And does changing numbers like this, going from 4 to 5 or 6 unrelated, result in more nuisance cases? And I think that that's speculative. We may be able to assume that, but I'm not sure that we know for certain. And also, I think what is the benefit and the priority? If the priority is to open up what would be a cost-effective way to house more people, and the unit, of course, has to be able to safely be able to do so, meaning it meets minimum life safety standards of both our housing code and our building code, then is zoning the correct tool to control for this? So I know that this will be an item that I'm sure many of our communities will want to talk to. I'm sure there will be some concern about it. If there is more research that we need, we've provided some that we could find. Communities handle it across the board very differently, and some communities don't control it. And I think Ryan had made mention of it. Our market's different. We have universities in town. Not all communities have universities, and so what are the impacts associated there?
I recall when we had the panel with the commissioners, and one of the commissioners citing living across the street, don't have all the details, of a unit with four in it and constant parties, parking problems, things like that. And so I'm not as, at least until I hear more discussion, I guess, as enamored with this kind of a tool to expand housing. And I guess I wonder, how do we know how many unrelated people do live in a place? That you don't already have 5 or 6 unrelated people in a place unless, somebody calls on you, or I don't know how that works.
Yeah, I mean, we're a complaint-based system.
Yeah.
And so if we get complaints and it is investigated, so in many of these cases, if it's unrelated individuals, then it's most likely a rental property, which means it should be certified. There can be an inspection to go in and count the number of sleeping areas, the number of beds that are in there. I guess I don't know fully all that documentation that code compliance would require to determine whether they're related or not, meaning people might make the claim that they're related, in which case maybe they ask for documentation. I'm not sure.
We just as a side note, the duplex that I live in, we just got inspected not too long ago, and it was a big deal. So I would say that Grand Rapids inspectors are on their job. They want to make sure if you say you got only 2 places where people sleep, if they see 3 beds, you're in trouble. So they're on their job.
But what if you have unrelated couples and, and so you have, it just feels a little like, policing lifestyle.
I will say that to that point, I think that was my question earlier. Well, not earlier, when we had our discussion with the city commission. But after thinking about it, I feel like the market itself will regulate that. If I'm staying with you and I'm unrelated, but you want to bring your significant other to live with us, it's a no for me unless your significant other is paying this rent as well. So I think the market would regulate that itself. We don't need an inspector for that.
And is this, why is this a different standard than if I'm a homeowner and I have 4 unrelated people or 5 unrelated people living with me? And I know it gets to sort of this idea of they're all college kids partying all night, but.
Well, I think it goes back to trying to control for the intensity of the use. And when you're living as a household, you have systems in place and rules in place that help manage impacts, whereas when you have unrelated individuals or their roommates, you tend to have 4 people or 5 people, whatever it may be, coming and going, different schedules. Things are of a different impact, results in a different impact than what you have as a family.
So, despite either of those consequences or philosophies, I just don't see where adding or allowing another person is going to make that big of an impact on our housing shortage. That's all and I'm going back to what kind of the commissioner said about the nuisance of it all too. Some nuisances, and I don't know how you regulate for that, but you said you can call somebody, do something about it. But it is the number of people that's causing those nuances or nuisances. Excuse me.
Ryan, do you have anything that you wanted to add on the potential?
Yeah, I think in terms of impact, it's another one that'll be similar to accessory dwelling units.
Your mic
Not loud
on?
enough. It is on.
Okay.
You're probably not going to see a lot of homeowners or property owners that greatly expand the number of bedrooms that they're renting as a result of this provision. We do have a couple of nonprofits that their economic model would be dependent on being able to allow for a greater number of adults in a shared housing situation. But this is another one where it's an incremental approach. It's not going to create 1,000 units overnight. It's probably not going to create 1,000 new bedrooms over 10 years. So if you didn't do it, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But the more of these that we're able to add in, the more units we can get. And I think Chris and I didn't talk about this in advance. I think bigger adjustments to the zoning ordinance probably require the community master plan adoption first. So any opportunity to really add significant housing to the city that isn't available today likely won't occur until after the community master plan process. These are sort of short-term interim steps that don't make a huge amount of difference, but can make a difference for a couple of families that really need it.
Do we have a number behind how many calls our code enforcement has received on this? Exceeding 4?
I'm certain that we do, and I can provide that information to the commission. I don't know offhand.
Okay, thank you.
Ready for discussion.
I think one of the things that came out of the city commission joint meeting that we held was, and from the presentations that we've seen, this is a pretty easy way to quickly free up beds for people and to add to available housing for folks. And so it's a low cost, low barrier way of helping folks out, and I'm in favor of it. I think 6 makes sense. I wouldn't want to just go to 5, 6 or more. And I think the argument in a couple of the supporting articles that we had was pretty compelling about, comparing it to airlines and flying with only half the seats full because, and allowing free luggage and things like that. Once the overhead compartments are full because they're allowing free luggage, then they can only seat so many people in the seats. I think that's a compelling argument when it comes to parking, by saying that it's going to add to on-street parking and things. The challenges that we're facing and that the folks in our town are facing, I think, are greater than the challenges of where to park a car. And I think, as was mentioned, having some of those district parking programs put in place will help. Permit parking and other mechanisms can help alleviate some of those concerns of the residents of a community versus folks that are just coming in to park to walk to work or whatever it might be. So, yeah, this is a good thing.
Yeah, I guess I think I don't have any much to add to that. I think, I think this will be a good change. I do think it can, I think like Ryan and others have said, it can be incremental. I think increments can be significant in the end. And if you have, often this would be young people or younger professionals. It doesn't have to be just college kids throwing parties, but and I think we have large structures in this community that, if for our rentals, could provide more housing for those, and maybe then provide additional options for people who maybe don't want to live in this type of setting that wouldn't be available otherwise, because we can put more people in these. So I would agree with the parking comments too. Parking is I think parking in our community expectations will change over time, and whether you have to park 3 doors down from your house or right in front, I think things that communities evolve into all the time. So I'm not as concerned about that. So I would support it.
If you're able to clarify, if you're willing to put a number out there, is it 5, is it 6, is it 8? Like what I heard Kyle say 6. It's just, I think it's an important distinction that I get a clear understanding of no, yes, 5, 6. What's your number, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I would support 6 in this effort. I think, is there, I guess what I would ask is, and maybe we'll get into it in the group living discussion, right? But if we're building a new structure with a parking area, does it then it becomes more of an SRO situation almost, right? If you had potentially 8, but yeah, I think 6 in a single family dwelling structure I think that's reasonable, and I would agree. I don't think going to 5 makes sense. Let's just go to 6. I don't know that more than that might not be appropriate right now, but I'm comfortable with 6.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. I agree. I'm comfortable with 6 as well. I mean, I was a young professional at one time in a big city and using public transit. And the growth of our city demands more housing. And as jobs continue to increase here, people are moving into this space as young professionals. They live among a group of people who are in the same situation. So I would support 6 as well. And I too am not very concerned about the parking situation at this point. I think I'll leave it at that.
4 seems a little low, but for me, 6 seems a little high. So I guess the happy middle is 5. But to one of the commissioners' point before, I was also a young professional living in Grand Rapids, and I lived in Heritage Hill, and I worked downtown, caught the bus, still bought a car. So I can't imagine not having a car even if I never use it. It's going to be parked somewhere. So I think to the community's point, parking will eventually be an issue, even in circumstances, obviously. I think there's going to be circumstances where you have folks, especially from the nonprofit groups, who are living in homes who don't have cars. But if you got young professionals who are unrelated living in home, they're going to be able to afford a car, and they're going to buy a car, because that's exactly what I did. So I think parking will become an issue eventually.
But I think that's where these programs come in. If there is some cost to having a car, whether that cost is you have to walk further to get to your house, or you have to pay for a monthly parking permit or something, that alleviates it. I think we shouldn't limit housing opportunities for the sake of cars. And you go to bigger cities where parking was an issue 10, 15, 20 years ago, those things start to level out where young professionals decide they don't need a car, at least a car near their home. There are other opportunities to, have a short-term rental car, borrowing it from a friend, things like that. And that is where the market starts to take care of things. But we do have programs in place in this city to help protect neighborhoods with parking constraints, or at least the residents of those neighborhoods with parking constraints. And so I think we lean more on those than by limiting housing opportunities for folks. I think it's more important to take care of that than my car.
Agree to disagree.
I just want to apologize to all college-aged people who like to party, since I was there one time, and I didn't mean to stereotype. And professionals do that too, as well as married people, and even
Professionals
old people like
have
me.
more time than college students. I didn't have time to party.
I will say on parking, having lived in Seattle, and I've told this to many people, I was a professional making, fairly good money. It is so expensive to park a car anywhere in Seattle, and it takes so much time, and they have great public transportation. I got rid of my car, which was a great thing to have. We aren't there yet. It's very easy to get around this city, and despite what a lot of people think, inexpensive to park.
I agree this is a move in a good direction. I'll just quote Tom Kutsier, who used to be a planning commissioner with us, who was in the housing market, and he always said, if you want to know what's going on with affordable housing, look at the amount of couch surfing that's going on. Yeah. So this just, I think, names something for what already is a way for people to live.
All right, that went a little quicker than I thought for that one. So I've looking at this, it sounds like the majority of the Planning Commission is comfortable increasing that unrelated occupants from 4 to 6. I think we can certainly provide some additional data on maybe parking utilization, just at least a link to it. Perhaps there's some additional transit information that might be helpful. I heard a request to better understand the number of complaints of unrelated occupants that we receive, so we can ask code compliance to help us obtain that data. Anything else that you think might be helpful for you to better understand to make this decision or recommend a decision?
I just want to state that I do agree with my colleagues to raise it to 6. I think I was speaking more from how do we know that isn't already happening, and just setting an arbitrary level, but I can understand why we do that too. So I'm not opposed to that.
This is a stupid question, but I don't know if this is the deal for rental units or units that are being leased. Is there costs from the folks leasing it for cars on the property?
That would, not from the city, but that could be a management tool that they use as to whether or not they charge additional monies for parking spaces.
Okay. And is there a requirement for the number of cars you can have on a property?
So, yes, currently, most of our single-family homes would require 2 parking spaces per unit, okay? And then we have a maximum number, which I think ends up going to 3 if you do that math, because it's 20. You can't overpark your site, meaning more than 20% above what is allowed. So when you take away fractions, it ends up being a 3rd parking space. So you can only build 3 parking spaces on a single-family home. You can't park your in anything other than the parking
space, okay.
Right? So you can't park it in your backyard legally or in your front yard. So those are where the nuisance codes come in to say you have a parked car in your backyard, that's not permitted.
Got you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Where's my cursor? Okay, so I want to flip back to our requirements our future conversations so that I can make sure we provide what you feel is going to be necessary or helpful for you to make a decision. So the next 3 buckets, if you will, for conversation are both in the group living requirements, the small scale infill development, and a review of parking and the parking requirements specific to single family homes. And so when we talk about group living in this context for policy change, I'm really focused on rooming and boarding houses, single room occupancy, SROs, or transitional shelters. Group living includes a whole variety of other uses, like nursing homes, for example. So I'm trying to focus on the long-term residential uses of this larger category. Currently, only rooming and boarding houses, which has an owner occupancy requirement, are permitted as a special land use within the low-density residential zone district. SROs and shelters are not permitted, meaning they must be in a different zone district. And so one of the thoughts I had to put on the table for discussion is starting to distinguish between small, medium, and large-scale group living uses. So looking at if transitional shelters might be okay in a residential zone district, maybe it's subject to special land use, and maybe it's only if the transitional shelter has no more than can accommodate no more than 6 individuals, for example. Or maybe if it has 1 to 4, it can be permitted by right, and if it's 5 or more beds, 5 to 12 beds, then it's permitted with special land use. So my point is there's ways to break this apart for us to consider smaller scale group living uses that might be considered, even with the Planning Commission review, but allowing some of these smaller scale uses to take place within our low-density residential zone districts. As a planning department, we've seen an increase in the number of small-scale requests, so conversion of former churches, for example. Many of our nonprofits that are doing more supportive housing are looking for ways to allow for more flexibility, more residential style living, needing the need to have more than 4 people live there. So that's the sort of direction I was thinking we could head in. Small scale infill, this one is pretty meaty in that there's a lot of opportunity for us. So this was really thinking about like duplexes and maybe tri or fourplexes. When we think about our residential, we define single family, duplexes or 2-family, and multifamily. And multifamily is a broad category. It's everything from 3 units and above. And so I was really looking at it to say, what if we define multifamily small as 6 or less and multifamily large as 7 and above, or something like tiering that apart a little bit? And what if we could allow for these smaller scale multifamilies to be permitted on some of our higher volume residential streets? So when we think about our traditional neighborhood specifically, where we have access to services, we have infrastructure in place, what if we were to allow 6 or less units by right on link residential or network residential? And I'll flip to that slide in a minute what that means. What if we were to eliminate or reduce our lot width and area requirements? Because currently multifamily is only permitted on lots that have at least 90 feet of frontage. So if you look at how our city is traditionally platted and the makeup of our lots, we don't have a lot of, if any, 90 feet frontage available for redevelopment. That means that you're going to see consolidation, acquisition, and consolidation, which if you're going to do that, then you need a whole lot of units for that to make financial sense. So that goes back to that bar chart that I showed that had a lot of pink, that some of these requirements are almost forcing these larger scale multifamily developments to exist. We're not seeing this missing middle style housing or the small scale multifamily developments because of these types of requirements. So I want to be able to look at that, and perhaps, like I said, maybe it only makes sense right now in our traditional neighborhoods because of the proximity or access to goods and services and supporting our neighborhood business districts. And maybe our mid-century and our modern era, maybe those conversations wait for the master plan. I mentioned about the link residential and the network residential. This is where I'd really like to go with our master plan as well, is tying our land use patterns to our infrastructure, to our transportation network. And when we think about what is a link residential, we have definitions for that. We know exactly where they are and where they're mapped. And I want to be able to give you this, I will give you this link so that you can start scrolling through the city and get a better understanding of what types of streets are link residential, for example, or network residential. So you can see by the nature of the definition that we've adopted through our Vital Streets plan that they tend to be higher volume streets, that they support higher density residential. That's what we intended with them. And you could start to see the street names that would look familiar to you to understand where they are. And then network residential is the dark green, and you can see again it starts to be these higher volume streets. They're not necessarily the streets that tend to be like embedded deep within the neighborhoods. And this is also a link to the dashboard that's been created that kind of that choose your own adventure to say, like, what if we were to do this? What would that potential impact, or what would that yield? And you can start to play with some of those, Ryan called them dials, and better understand that. So I've taken a bit more of a broad brush approach just to introduce the topic, but we could always nuance that further to say if it's link residential and it has an alley, but only if it's on a transit route do we want to allow multifamily by right. And you can start to explore, and if you click on those, you'll start to see how many properties does that really mean. And I think importantly, is that going to make a difference? So I mentioned earlier when I took the scenario, I guess that's better than choose your own adventure, when I took the scenario of what if 2-family dwellings are permitted by right on those 2 street types? We know how many properties that are zoned residential on those street types. If every one of those converted, which we know is infeasible, unlikely. If every one of those converted, that would yield 14,000 new units in the city. So you can start to see, like, that's a pretty strong tool that we can use. Well, what if we said that was a 4-plex? And you could look at the number of units that would yield, the potential. So I think that's important just to understand if we're going to start to turn those dials, what would that look like? And understanding that some of these need to work in concert with other changes. So if we're not going to accept conversions of existing single-family homes on those street types, then allowing duplexes might not make sense. Or if we're not going to allow for a reduction in parking requirements on those certain street types or in the traditional neighborhoods, the lots simply are not big enough to say, let's make this existing single-family home a 4-plex, but oh, by the way, let's also require 2 parking spaces per unit. Like, that doesn't fit, so there's no point in doing one if we're not prepared to do the other. And then the last piece of this is exactly that, is the parking requirements. That in order for this to make sense and for these changes to work together, I think we have to be prepared to at least look at reducing parking requirements in certain circumstances, or maybe in all circumstances. That's part of the conversation. But I think talking about an incremental approach might be more appropriate for us to look at, TN districts with link residential, network residential, where we know that there's either easy access, close access, or there is on a transit line. And then we evaluate. We take a step back in a year when we're done with our master plan and say, what impact was that? Was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? Did the world fall apart? No, maybe we look at another change and evaluate, versus just making these larger zoning changes and then trying to recover from potential impacts or negative impacts that we maybe didn't expect or hoped wouldn't happen. And why the TN district? Again, I focused on, that their access to goods and services, our bike infrastructure is coming along. They are walkable neighborhoods. They score well on the walk scores. And many of them are served by transit, or at least have good access to transit. So that's why I've started focusing on more of the traditional neighborhood. So that's the next conversation in October, where we'll go through like I've just done. But I will provide you with some of the links to the dashboards, to the vital streets, so that you can understand what streets are we talking about. And I guess right now I want to know, what else do you need? We're doing research. We'll continue to do research on best practices and zoning reform ideas, and share those articles with you so that you can continue reading. I know that there's good podcasts. I listened to the newest one from APA last night. That was the planning director for Charlotte. And now Greenville, I think it is. I probably butchered that. Anyways, he had a lot of really great things to say about their master plan and incremental zoning changes. So there's a lot of good resources, if you can spend the time doing that, so that we are making educated recommendations to the City Commission.
One thing that might be nice to know are what are adjacent municipalities doing, because we're a metro region, and when people are shopping for housing options, they're often shopping across the region. And so at least being aware of how it goes adjacent might be helpful.
With their housing policy?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I might look to Brooke and Ryan to help me with that, because they've got more conversations going with our adjacent, yep. I know that within the last couple of weeks, the city of Walker did put a moratorium on any new multifamily development pending a further revision to their master plan. So we know that that's in place, but we can certainly look at Kentwood, Wyoming, et cetera.
And I'm not sure, maybe this is a Ryan question too, I'm not sure. Is there another, a city that is similar in size, demographic, that maybe we can take a look at what they've done around this? And if we're ahead of them, if we're behind them, or if we're kind of on the same path, if we could take a look at something like that.
Anything else that you think would be helpful? Okay, well, when we start sharing out these links and information, feel free to email us if you think of something that you may not have thought about today, and we'll do our best to get that information. So again, in October, it'll be a discussion, and then with the goal of getting all of your feedback and putting together a policy recommendation that you'll consider and then host a public hearing on. So I'm trying not to run too fast. We want to keep moving forward, but I also want to make sure that you have time and we're intentional with our conversations, because these are important changes.
Yeah, thank you for the resources that were provided for today's meeting. Look forward to reading through for the next set of topics. I'll just note that we have correspondence on a few things that are included in your packets or were handed out today. Is there any other business we need to handle before public comment? No? All right, then I'll open up the public comment period of the meeting. Ask that you state your name for the record. Keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. And yeah, feel free to queue up if you'd like.
There we go. Thank you. Coleman Barr. I'm with Neighbors Development. I also live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, have since 2012. Thank you very much for considering these changes. I appreciate that you guys are looking at this. I think these are the changes that you needed to make over 10 years ago. And I think you're really, really far behind on making these adjustments. The proposed changes that you're entertaining are barely going to do a blip on anything. And we're talking about adding 200 ADUs when we need to be building, 2,000 units per year. Right now, Grand Rapids, over 90% of the properties in Grand Rapids have the exact amount of units or more than what is allowed on them. So the fact is, when we're really understating the problem here, and one of the things that's kind of upsetting, Mr. Jonker, if I could have your attention, please. One of the things that really upsets me is hearing you guys say, well, there's other things besides zoning that are getting in the way, like costs and so on. And we're not really understanding the impact that zoning is having on this, because we are already maxing out our property here. We're doing the maximum of what's allowed. The only way to create more units is to buy several units, knock them down to replace them with a bigger building. That's why we are only seeing that type of building happen. So I would hope that you would entertain doing everything that you're doing today, plus getting rid of maximum size for ADUs, plus adding so much more to what is allowed to be done, because you're not even scratching the surface, and you're basically making another change that we're going to fall short on our goals. The one last thing that I want to address is in regards to the addition of non-related parties. And I don't like the way that we talk about young people in society. We wouldn't speak about our seniors in this way. We wouldn't talk about, issues caused by different demographics of people. But for some reason, our people that are, I don't know if we're talking about children or we're only talking about the 18-year-olds to 22-year-olds, but I think that...
All right, thank you, sir. Your time's up. Thank you.
I think those are important people who should be considered as well.
All right, thank you.
Hello, I'm Jim McClure, and I've been a resident of the city for about 40 years. Man, I've got lots of experience on every angle of this. As a homeowner in Heritage Hill, living in a dense neighborhood, as a homeowner who has an accessory dwelling unit and has for many years, I know the benefits of it and the drawbacks. And then also being a business owner, labeled a developer by the city, and just how difficult it is to develop properties and to do that quickly and economically. There's just all kinds of things that are working against us in the city to do this right and to do it effectively and to do it quickly, as quickly as we need to. So I respect this process. I really am glad that Grand Rapids is taking it seriously, looking at it from every angle. We've got folks like Ryan and Kristen and people that we trust to guide this process. It's really well done. But some of the problems that we have ahead of us are the same problems we're going to have in the future, and that is just the trust process, like Lawrence brought up. I mean, there are marginalized people in this city that could be easily taken advantage of if you don't have either the time or the capability or the will to keep your head ear to the ground, and if you've got your head down working, you don't have time to come to a process like this. If we're not communicating with people that are immediately affected by things very clearly, and making sure that we have a positive contact with a neighbor, and even expanding that 300-foot radius, we're leaving people out of the process that really have to have an impact on it. We've been a victim of that, both in our businesses and in our personal life, that, people are allowed to do things because they're just outside that 300-foot radius from me, that I didn't get that communication, but I would have liked to. That I was part of that process where other people had an opinion on things that I was doing, but I didn't have the same given to me. And then most recently with the home next door at 233 College on my street, it was really bad communication. And even when you've got people that you should be able to trust involved in the process, bad actors and bad consequences can happen if you don't have good communication and if you don't have buy-in from everybody. So I think we need to be careful that we don't have unintended consequences, and that we go above and beyond and develop a process that has a more robust communication structure around it, so everybody can have an opportunity to have an impact and have a voice.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Zubko, and I live in Heritage Hill. I wanted to bring up a point about the increase from 4 to 6 within one structure of unrelated occupants. I do think there needs to be more thought on that, because a one-bedroom house is not an appropriate place to have 6 unrelated occupants. So please consider including something about the number of bedrooms. That just creates opportunity for abuse and improper situation in terms of the capacity of the home to support that. So I do think a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, potentially even a 3-bedroom shouldn't be considered to allow 6 occupants. I think we should be talking about 4 bedrooms plus. The other item I wanted to just briefly touch on is changes to parking requirements. Again, a lot of parking is going to be an issue just because of the nature of Grand Rapids, the nature of, like Mr. Williams said, if you can afford a car, you're going to find a way to buy it and park it somewhere. We do need parking management to be able to deal with some of the issues that are going to come up. And that management doesn't necessarily have to be the city requiring parking for new structures, but management of the on-street parking and management of parking to make sure it's available for the residents that need it. And of course, obviously supporting public transit and supporting transit shelters. So I would love to see new multifamilies and other structures be built, but with parking shelter or bus shelters available at nearby stops to encourage that kind of use. We want to see public transit get better in Grand Rapids and be more available and convenient for everyone. So attaching shelters to new multifamily units, I think, would be a good direction for us to go. Thank you.
Hi. My name's Ian Smith. I live in Heritage Hill. Whoops.
Could you pull the microphone up? Thanks.
Am I too tall? Okay. I actually came to talk about the density issue, but I'll give you my 2 cents worth on the ADU issue. I unfortunately was the first person to do an ADU in Missoula, Montana. And I went through, the entire process. And, I give you some feedback that might help you. But what I learned was that making an investment with an unknown return is very difficult. And there was a bureaucratic inertia within the city of Missoula because they didn't have the experience to give the investor good feedback. And so they've had their I did it in 2015. I bet you they don't have a dozen ADUs after all these years. And the problem is you don't know what your taxes are going to be. Nobody tells you you're going to have a different address. Nobody coordinates between the water company. Nobody tells you, well, you deal with different departments and somebody tells you your parking is in compliance and then you spend all the money and then you find out you're out of compliance and you've got to pour a slab. It's very, very difficult. And then you got to brand your deed. And I do think that your idea about having both sides non-owner occupied is really good. I think if I had had that when I sold my property, I probably would have made a decent return on my investment. And it turns out I made a terrible return on my investment because an owner had to be on one side and it caused some issues. So anyway, food for thought, but I think you're headed in the right direction. Just really quickly on the density issue, living in Heritage Hill, one of the things, I'm concerned about is we pay a tax, which is a compliance tax, right? Is it costs more to get stuff done in Heritage Hill because of the historical district requirements on construction and stuff like that, And so I'm really concerned about making investments. Is it a good investment with only 30% of the community being owner occupied? And every time I hear about having, non-owner occupancy, it just makes me wonder, will people continue to want to invest in the neighborhood? So I think you need to think about that. And if you are going to increase the incentives for landlords to have more single rooms, are you going to create an incentive for people to take these beautiful old houses and turn them into rental properties, or take these beautiful old houses that have been all cut up and not turn them back into single-family dwellings? Anyway, that's my food for thought.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Leslie Van Becker. My husband Ed Clifford and I have lived in Heritage Hill since the fall of 1977. Fast forward to the present, we now own 4 properties, our single-family home and 3 rental properties, and we are receiving offers in the mail every week from investors wanting to buy our houses. We have worked long and hard for years to rehab our properties from slums to beautiful properties. We have worked towards ridding our neighborhood of crime, sometimes at threat of our own safety, and bad absentee landlords. On the block that Ed and I live, we own our single-family home and a 5-unit apartment building built in 1910. Our building was built as apartments. It has no driveway and no off-street parking. I have spent hours calling 311 to try to fix our trash problem because there's not room for 10 trash cans, including recycling bins, on our strip in front of our house. The people have knocked over the cans when they're trying to put them on their mechanical lifts that have been in use since 2012. So that is a problem. And across the street is a mansion that has been converted into 10 apartments. This building has also no off-street parking. Yes, there is hugely congested parking at the end of the block, since there are some 2- and 3-unit buildings on our block that have no off-street parking also. We already have high density in Heritage Hill. We also have, within a block of our house, treatment homes. We already have them. And we also have buildings that were supposed to be zoned single-family and have been given a pass to be 3 units, and one of those units has 9 people living in it. So we have density already in Heritage Hill. I would really like the Planning Commission to consider our historic neighborhood. we have unique problems and concerns. And also, please consider the large financial payments from increased tax revenue and the unique and priceless cultural gift of restored homes and an integrated neighborhood that this neighborhood has given the city of Grand Rapids. These priceless gifts can be easily lost by many of the propositions that you are considering. And thank you for hearing me.
Hi, my name is Barbara Heckheis. I live in Heritage Hill. I've been here for about 40 years, and I've had 2 different properties that had rental properties in them. I currently live in a duplex. My concern is that a lot of people don't live in the city like I do. They don't live in the other areas that have become very dense. There are areas of our city that are already dense, and when you put a blanket thing changing the requirements from 4 to 6, it exponentially impacts those areas that already have multiple numbers of units. So if you're on your block and there's one house that's a rental house and you go from 4 to 6, it isn't hardly felt on your block. If you have on my block, there's 4 houses that are duplexes right now. We tend to try to keep them small as an owner occupant and as someone who cares about my neighbor because of the parking. If I were to put the number of people in my units allowed, that would put 8 people on the street, 4 on each side. There is not any parking on that. People are already walking multiple distance and links and sometimes other blocks to park their cars. But if I go from 8 people, and now you're going to let me have 6 on each side, that's 12. Well, that's just one of the houses. There's 4 of them already on the street that have that. I think you need to think about that impact you have on already dense areas, and that maybe something needs to be required that, all right, if your area already is in one of these dense areas, we're going to hold to the 4, because these areas don't have even the electrical infrastructure to handle more use, much less water, sewer, and other things. We just don't have the space. A lot of our buildings are old and they're not built to handle the noise situations. It could really complicate things for us. So please consider looking at different areas of the city differently. If you're already in one of the top dense areas, this will make our living situation a negative one, and I think we would lose people coming and investing in our areas as it would be overcrowded. It's already crowded. Thank you.
My name is Nancy Beckwith. I live at 264 Paris Southeast, which is between Cherry and Wealthy. My husband and I bought that house because in 1975, because we were redlined, the neighborhood was redlined, and also he was divorced and you couldn't get a mortgage at that point. So I've been there longer, 2 years longer than Leslie and Ed. But anyway, and the only reason Heritage Hill has the boundaries it has as a history lesson to you is that Cherry Hill, Easttown, Baxter neighborhood, Heritage Hill, they could only take so many control one size of an area, and they had to pay for an architectural survey in 1969 by themselves, because that's why it has the boundaries it has. Not that other neighborhoods within the center city were not worthy of historic preservation and protection, particularly Baxter also. But I want to just tell you briefly, I'm getting a little confused if we're dealing with the ADUs and the group homes and homeless people, and who are these houses for? I have a house, Mel Tardy and his brother Ray Tardy started Kent Cap. Mel lived across the street from us until he died. His house is sold, and it's owned by American Realty, and that man has 500 units in the city. And he tells his tenants regularly in the single-family home, you can have 4, but they say you can have 4, but you can have 6. You can have up to 6. Well, guess what? They don't come to school with bikes, or excuse me, come here to live with bikes. They have cars, they have nicer cars than we do. And then they have their friends over, or they have their boyfriends over. So we have 6 people living there illegally. I've called it in, it's been going on for years, nothing happens. I called about getting the grass cut. The response from the person at American Realty was, we do what the city tells us to do. That is their attitude towards the city of Grand Rapids. But also, if in regards to ADUs, you can get a container helicoptered in and dropped in your backyard, because I know a law professor who teaches at Berkeley, and she has one in her backyard. So you need to be prepared for stuff like that. And the other thing also is that we are, like Leslie said, any of us who have lived in the Hill for any length of time, we are plagued with people wanting to buy our properties, and I couldn't afford to live in my neighborhood anymore, and we have a lot of investors in our neighborhood, and they are going to cram as many people into those houses as they can, and they are not going to give a diddly damn what the city of Grand Rapids thinks and what you think, that we should have 6 people. So I would encourage you to stay at 4.
Hi, my name is Sarah Lockman. I also reside in Heritage Hill. And as these important discussions go on, I'd just like to encourage this committee to consider the creation of an overlay zoning district or amendments to those current protections for the historic district that would allow for sustained protection of it. The Heritage Hill Historic District is a roughly 37-block area. It's listed in the National Register of Historic Places as of 1972. The district was established 2 years later, in 1974. It remains as one of the largest urban historic districts in the entire country. In 2017, this city heralded the historic district as, quote, representing one of the largest and finest concentrations of American architecture of the 19th and 20th centuries in Michigan. That statement is not mere self-congratulations, commonly cited by travel articles as a key attraction to Grand Rapids. The Wall Street Journal has even recognized and featured the remarkable character of the nature of the neighborhood. And notably, the American Planning Association identified Heritage Hill Historic District as one of the, quote, great places in America. After 180 years, Heritage Hill stands as one of Grand Rapids' gems. But while the historic district reflects Grand Rapids' pride, rich history, and its founders' triumphs, it also reflects a cautionary tale. Nestled within the neighborhood are pockets of poorly laid plans and scars of this city's self-inflicted wounds. Today, the historic district contains approximately 1,300 structures, endowed with more than 60 architectural styles. Most homes were built between 1840 and 1920 for single-family residences. In the 1930s and 1940s, developers turned many of the homes into apartment buildings. Later in the 1960s, developers rapidly began converting a great number of large houses into multi-unit residences and office buildings. Unsatiated, just prior to receiving its protected status, based on several urban renewal projects with municipality support, private development plans had developers slated to level 75% of what we now have as our historic district. By 1968, wrecking balls were rampant throughout downtown Grand Rapids. City legend Mary Stiles, in efforts to save City Hall, crowned with its iconic clock tower, chained and handcuffed herself to the wrecking ball, but an ultimately fruitless act of defiance. While many have determined that to be an egregious the destruction of City Hall is an egregious mistake, many found it to be an alarm bell for protection of the Heritage Hill District. I've provided all of you with a short summary with a number of statistics that I hope you will look at about the historic district.
Right.
It's increased density already.
Thank
and
you.
how it relates to other neighborhoods.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Doug Meeks. I live in Heritage Hill as well. Not a shocker that there are so many people here from Heritage Hill, because we truly believe that some of the things that you guys are looking at could really affect our neighborhood. And that's important to all of us for many reasons, but we love this city and we want you guys to do what's in the best interest of the city. But I think one of the things that you guys need to really look at before making a determination on this is, I keep hearing this call for an emergency, or there's crisis for housing, or these are barriers that are put up, and that language to me is very dog whistly. I don't think that anyone's talked about the fact that the city of Lansing, or the city of Grand Rapids, has lost 1% population last year. There are things other than this one report that show a movement from people living in the city to moving out to the districts of the county. Is there a crisis? There probably is a crisis. I'm not here or qualified to tell you whether there is or there isn't. But what I would say is that I do echo Mr. Williams' position in many of this. We're talking about affordable housing, right? What you guys are doing and these changes to the zoning ordinances is basically changing things for people that already own homes. So as a homeowner, I could now go and do an ADU, but when we're looking at affordable housing, we're looking at housing for people that don't have homes, that aren't capable of purchasing a home in order to create wealth in their life. And that's the number one thing. We know that if you own a home, you are likely to grow wealth in a way that's intergenerational. So when we talk about affordable housing, we should be talking about that. What we've been talking about for the last 2 hours is 1,200 units, possibly over a 10-year period. And what this crisis that we're talking about is supposedly in the next 5 years, we need all of this. Well, we've talked about, from what we were discussing today, 600 in the next 5 years. Now, ADU, I think that you guys need to consider the fact that there are certain times in which ADU situations could be very destructive. I mean, if you have an individual who is going through foreclosure, that the person that's renting their apartment or that apartment, what rights do they have? I mean, you're opening yourself up to a lot of unintended consequences, and I think that that's something that the city attorney's office, that you should discuss with the city attorney's office, because there are certain things. So I would ask that, and I thank you all for listening to this.
Thank you.
Today. Thank you. I'm sorry. It's Doug Meeks, M-E-E-K-S.
Hello. I wasn't planning to talk today, but decided I should. My name's Bev Borman. I live in Heritage Hill. I've lived there for 35 years. I'm also a realtor here in Grand Rapids, and I've sold real estate here for over 40 years. And I'd like to speak about the issue of raising the number of people per unit from 4 to 6. In selling homes, especially to investors, I can tell you that what they look for is a 4-bedroom, 2-bath. You can put 4 people, each have their own bedroom, two bathrooms, 2 people per bathroom. But if they can't find that, they will do a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom and just stack, 2 people in a room. So if you are thinking that you're going to increase extra housing by going from 4 to 6, really all you're doing is letting the landlords, and I was a landlord in both Grand Rapids and Wyoming, so I can speak to the landlord issue as well, is the landlord's just going to pack more people into that house. The rent's not going to go down. I know that was one of the advantages, is now, we have more people to spread this cost through, but they won't. They'll just stuff the house with as many people as they can. The rent will go up. because now they have more people. So I don't think what you're trying to solve is really being solved there. I'd also like to say, I think Barbara had already mentioned that Heritage Hill is already in an extremely high-dense area. We already have a huge parking problem, and it was someone up here had mentioned they didn't think parking would be an issue. You're welcome to drive down my street. I live on Avalon Terrace. You can drive on Union between Fulton and Cherry. Windsor Terrace, Fitch, Kellogg, they're all right by my house. They're completely packed all day and all night. And part of it's because we already have rentals. And right now, when you have 4 people in a unit, there's 4 cars. But there's usually, it's either 4 men or 4 women typically, and they all have partners or they date. And so suddenly you've gone from 4 cars to 8 cars. So if you say, well, we're going to let 6 people in a unit, all of a sudden you're going to probably have 10 to 12 cars you have to deal with. So parking is an issue. I would hope that you would consider that. If you do feel the need to increase from 4 to 6, I would hope that you would look at parts of the city that are already extremely dense, that are already taking a lot of rental properties, and make an exception on those parts. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Dane Gates. I am a part of Grand Rapids for Affordable Housing Coalition. We advocate for the residents of our city that are 0 to 30% area median income, the most marginalized residents in our city. And I'm glad to be a part of this conversation today. But I would like to share that it's not, first of all, I'd like to share it's a housing crisis. It's a crisis in our nation, and it's affecting all of us. And it's important to do things, in addition to doing them fast, it's important to do them well. You will probably not find a person more on earth more compassionate about the unhoused than I am. And so I would say that in part of this conversation, who you have at the table matters. We need marginalized people. I look at this body and I pray and I wished in my heart that it was more diverse so that more voices could enter in. I am a strong advocate for equity, because that's a lot of the thing that plagues our country today. Things are inequitable. We advocate for the fact that housing is a human right. A human person should have some decent place to live. Housing is also a social determinant of health. Our physical health, our mental health, and our nation is in a crisis, and it's time for each one here to take responsibility and do our part to right the thing that has occurred. I don't have all the answers to that, but as I am here today, I spend a lot of time advocating for it, and I encourage you to join me in that. There are so many things in my mind. I wasn't prepared to speak to you today, or I would have written them down. But I assure you I will be back. You will see me again. I come regularly to the Affordable Housing Board meetings, and I continue to do that. So I look forward to next time when I will be more prepared to come back to see you. And Grand Rapids is a great city, and I know we can make an amazing difference here and in our nation. Thank you.
My name's Matt Overman, and I kind of changed what I was going to say. I live in the southeast side, right across from Garfield Park, and I own 523 Lion in Heritage Hill, and it's crazy that the landlord sucks so bad. Like
could you excuse me? Can you direct your comments?
Yeah,
to us,
sorry.
please?
It's like I don't get there's part of me that goes, as Heritage Hill goes, it sounds like that's who's being represented here. You know, as I sit in the back and I'm hearing it, I mean, it's a constant stream of Heritage Hill, and they're strong. That's a strong neighborhood, and they're advocating for themselves, and I think that that's really helpful. As somebody who owns property, who hopes to live in that property at some point in time, I love that. But at the same point in time, if we are talking housing in Grand Rapids and how expensive it is, any housing added to the backbone of Grand Rapids is going to help lower costs in the long run across the board. If you don't have it, cost benefit, like, supply and demand are going to be what they are. If supply keeps going down, demand keeps going up, investors are going to be the only ones who can actually afford housing. And that's horrible. That's horrible. And so I don't know how to fix it, but I will say expanding housing somehow, some way will get it so that, you know, we get to that fulcrum where maybe it is a bit more affordable, and it's not just investors buying. It is people that are able to save enough and get back into the housing market. But I know on both sides, and I feel that from the crowd, and you're in a pickle, and that sucks. But I think that there is balance here, and I think Heritage Hill, way to go, way to show up. Nobody from my Garfield Park never shows up, you know. But we get that, and I think that I just want, on the big side of things, on what we are talking about right now, these are all good ideas. Implementation is huge. And parking, as we take away parking because we keep adding bike lanes and stuff, it's just going to get worse. And so either the parking has to go or the bikes have to go. That's it.
Hi, my name is Liz Bracken. Not surprisingly, Heritage Hill as well, but I've only been there for a year. So just an observation as you consider all of these things. I don't think I can say anything better than anybody who came before me, but as somebody who came from, you know, far away from the city, I've been struck by the parking issue from the perspective of the rest of the city services. As Leslie noted, the trash situation on our street on Union is abysmal. I would not have imagined I would have to call the city, I think 12 times in 18 months about my trash. And I get the city side where, you know, I put my trash where it's supposed to be, it's the number of feet where it's supposed to be, and then some car comes, and another car comes, and another car comes, and next thing you know, the trash can't get picked up. Same thing with, you know, emergency services. Parking is very tight on both sides of the 2 blocks of Union where I live. You know, I've seen emergency vehicles not able to pass through because the cars are parked in such a way, especially in the winter months, where it's difficult. So as you consider all of this, you look at the parking impact, I think you need to look at the bigger infrastructure pieces that impact that as well, because, you know, we went a month with our trash not picked up, and in the summer, I think it's unsafe, it's unsanitary, and it needs to get figured out somehow. So if you could just add that to your thinking as you evaluate. Thank you.
I'm Lisa McManus. I live in Heritage Hill, like so many people here. I just do some work with Oakdale neighbors, and I know a lot of the people that live in that community are rent houses. So I would ask that you reconsider your stance on owner occupancy for ADUs. And I'm concerned that those rental houses, if I understand what's going on here correctly, those rental houses could all add an extra unit in the back if the landlords don't have to live in those houses. I see that as a really negative thing for the families that live there now. you're packing more and more people into the same property. So I would ask you to consider how to not make a density situation worse by allowing those landlords to add extra units without having to live there. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Kara Phillips. I also live in Heritage Hill. I'm going to probably broach something a little bit different, but also what Mr. Williams brought up with regards to the ADUs and who is truly benefiting. I think when we do have a need for housing, we have a need for affordable housing. I don't know that that is necessarily being addressed in this. And I would like to do more research and come back and present more information. But I do fear that down the road, one of the unintended consequences of some of these changes could be moving our market of housing from a homeowner market to a rental-only market. I do fear that this makes it much more enticing for investors to come in. If you look historically, right now what's going on, people are moving back to city centers. And potentially this is just a profitable land grab. And cities, neighborhoods, communities benefit from home ownership. So anything that we could also do to encourage home ownership at all sorts of levels, not single-family houses, but multiple sizes, multiple costs. I think for the long run, that is something that we greatly need to focus on and consider so that we do have greater equity. We do have a strong, committed contribution to the city and the neighborhoods at large. And it's not just a matter of corporate investment. Thank you.
I wasn't exactly expecting to say anything either. My name is Reed Taylor. I live in Heritage Hill. I want to bounce off what she said. I married Jane 20 years ago, and she had bought her home in 1984 when she got it for a fire sale because it was a dangerous neighborhood. At night, there were people screaming and gunshots, and cars were being abandoned in the back alley and set on fire. This was not hearsay, it was happening then. And actually, I feel like I'm in a room with people who have been in Heritage Hill for decades and who have worked really hard for a goal, to make Heritage Hill a true historic district. Now, what is that? Part of it, it seems to me, is home ownership. I am very sensitive to the fact that you want to create places where people can live. I'm glad, and we want to be a part of that. But is it possible to preserve what is unique about Heritage Hill? There are people who have worked for decades to take structures that were not in good shape and make it something special and be very proud of it. I hope you can fulfill your objectives, critical objectives about helping more people have places to live, while at the same time honoring what Heritage Hill is. It's unique. It's been said to you already today what an incredibly unique place that is. Let's try to preserve it and get the housing needs met. Thanks.
All right, anyone else interested in speaking today? Okay, I'll close public comment. Anything else, commissioners? Staff? All right, we're adjourned. Thanks.